It's called the National Defense Authorization Act of 2025. It's a new bill that is being advanced to the full Senate from the Senate Armed Services Committee, and it will make it possible for your wife and your daughters to go into combat in the years ahead. How do we think about this biblically? At no point in U.S. history have women been subject to a military draft. What the new bill proposes is that if the military is unable to sufficiently staff the numbers necessary for future wars and military actions, if the volunteer approach to enlistment doesn't provide the numbers necessary, it allows for the implementation of a military draft. Now, what this bill does is it, for the first time ever, includes women with the requirement that upon turning 18, that they go fill out the paperwork, as men have been doing for years, the paperwork of the Military Selection Service Act, which puts you in the registry to be drafted should a draft ever become necessary. It's interesting, this news seems to be the logical next step to the kind of erosion of the rights and safety of women that we see in other places in our culture. For example, in the name of gender inclusivity and political progress, the current presidential administration has implemented a number of things that, in a sense, eliminate distinctions between men and women. We've seen the Biden administration attempt to make amendments to Title IX so that women's spaces are open to men who merely self-identify as women. We've seen the judicially mandated transfer of violent male sex offenders into women's prisons with predictable results. We've seen the culmination of a number of calls from the progressive left that biological men have access now to single-sex spaces like domestic violence shelters and rape crisis centers. On top of that, we no longer have Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, we just have Scouts. We no longer will eventually have women's sports, we'll see that dominated by biological men wearing women's clothes. This is, in one sense, the military simply catching that cultural trend, catching that flow in the direction that it's been going, and creating a military that will now be coeducational. How do we think about this business of women going to war in a biblical sense? Well, let me ask you to consider the book of Judges. Judges in the Old Testament is a book that details a particular period of Israelite history that traces a decline of biblical and theological faithfulness. As that declines, the culture itself spirals downward into what you might call a kind of moral chaos. For example, when we look at the book of Judges, we find in the very first chapter a woman by the name of Aksa. Aksa is the daughter of one of the heroes of Israel, a man named Caleb. You'll remember Caleb with Joshua, one of the two original spies that pushed for Israel to step into conquest of the promised land by faith in God. He was overruled by the majority report of those who said, no, we can't do it. There are giants in the land. Well, that generation died off in the wilderness as a judgment of God, and Joshua and Caleb were allowed to live and see the promised land. As they moved under the leadership of Joshua into the promised land, Caleb was the one saying, give me my mountain. He'd been dreaming about God's rewards for his faithfulness for 40 years. As they go through the period of the conquest, there is a particular battle where Caleb says, to the man who leads us to win this battle, I will give my daughter Aksa in marriage. Now, what's fascinating is there was a moment in Israelite history where a woman was seen to be a prize. She was of such value that men would put their lives on the line to defend the women of the nation. They were so interested in receiving the blessing of a good and godly woman like Asa, coming from a strong family like the family of Caleb, that they literally were inspired to great military deeds because they were following God and they were honoring the women among them. If you go through the book of Judges, what we see in chapter 1 is that the daughter of Caleb was honored. She was prized. There was something significant about making a sacrifice in order to win the godly woman. And yet, as we go through the book of Judges, what we find is that there is, in chapter 4, an assassination by a woman. In chapter 9, another assassination in the most dramatic ways. In chapter 11, a young girl loses her life because of her father's warped and unnecessary pledge. In other words, the honor given to women in Judges chapter 1 then is replaced by a downward spiral where women are increasingly put into more and more violent situations. It's a reflection of the descent of the culture itself further and further away from God. Not only do we move from women being prized and honored all the way down to women being put into more violent and dangerous situations, but we also move from a woman in chapter 1 whose name is given, whose family is known, who is honored as something special. We follow this downward spiral until toward the end of the book of Judges, we have women who are not even named. They have no identity. They're simply commodities to be used however they need to be used by those who have no sense of honor or value. Consider Judges 19. When we get to Judges 19, we find an unnamed concubine, the legal wife of a Levite, who is abandoned by her husband and then surrendered to a mob of worthless, lecherous men who gang raped her to the point of death. She had no name. She had no masculine protector. She left no recorded words. She gives us no agency. The crimes against her incited civil unrest and even further violence. If you want to read Judges chapter 19, prepare yourself, because it is one of the most vicious, violent episodes recorded in the entire Bible. And unlike the critics of the Bible, this is not a scene of some bloodthirsty Old Testament God who wants destruction and extends wrath. These are the sins of a nation that knew better, but they had wandered so far from God that their treatment of women actually is evidence of their theological and moral descent into anarchy. How did the state of women in Israel spiral from an honored daughter to a nameless commodity? It happened because the nation itself spiraled into depravity. The commands of God and the common good are always inextricably linked. When every man does what is right in his own eyes, every woman is vulnerable. There is a parallel here because we now live in a nation where our leaders will submit women to a draft simply because those women have become commodities to be used however the progressive left sees fit. This is nothing to celebrate. It is not a reflection of some sort of gender equity or social advancement. It is not a step forward into some utopian vision of all of us living together, of men and women being interchangeable parts. It is, however, an alarming diagnosis of our spiritual, moral, and cultural health. We are a deeply unhealthy nation in our spirits. Should this act be put into place, women will be eligible for conscription in the military. There will no longer be a ban that separates women from frontline combat units. Is there a father in America who, under any circumstance, would risk having his daughter exposed to this? Is there a husband in this country who thinks that it's okay for his wife to risk being captured and tortured by our enemies, to risk becoming a prisoner of war? Is this the kind of people we want to be? I would sooner lose my own arm than to allow such a thing to happen to my wife or daughters. And I don't think that I'm alone in this. In countries ravaged by war, it's traditionally been considered a tragedy when the battle comes into the backyards of our women and children. When women have to pick up arms and fight, it is always as the last resort because all other lines of defense have fallen. How could any man let a woman stand between himself and the conflict? Should we not fight to the last man before letting the war come to our wives and daughters and mothers? On average, women have a bone structure and a muscle mass that is a fraction of that for men. You don't have to be a conservative or even a Christian to acknowledge this. It is an empirical fact observable to anyone that has eyes to see. This puts women at a distinct disadvantage in combat, and it weakens the military readiness of a nation. Now, many women have served admirably in the military, and there are certainly a handful who are physically exceptional and who show some aptitude for combat. But that's the point. They are exceptional. They're not the norm. And to implement a draft that assumes that all women can step into military service in the same way that just a tiny handful of exceptional women with certain physical capabilities can do is both absurd and dangerous. That's why we should oppose any policy that might lead to women being conscripted into frontline combat units. At the end of the day, this issue is irreducibly moral. It goes to the heart of what kind of people we wish to be. Are we really so committed to the gender theories that are presented as so much nonsense in our generation that we are willing to send our wives and our daughters to be ground up by the rigors of military combat? For the sake of our families, for the sake of our nation, I hope that is not who we have become. This is Truth Currents.